So the Tayleur. The Tayleur is an interesting vessel technically and in its navigation and in the number of passengers that were lost and in the way it came across the Irish Sea and ran into Lambay, and indeed for its innovation in the way it was built. It was an iron clipper ship, and there's various things said in newspapers and accounts, and there's an awful lot of misinformation about the Tayleur and material that was copied ad infinitum. There's people that insist on calling it the RMS Tayleur, though it never carried a letter. There's people that say it was the largest ship ever built, sort of thing. No, it wasn't. It was the largest iron-built clipper ship of its time. There were bigger warships. There were steamships like the Great Eastern and the Great Britain, which were much, much bigger. And so, you know, the superlatives go on and on and on. The one thing that we're missing is a coherent passenger list. And there's various estimates as we'll go through later. So that's just one of the aspects of the whole story of the Tayleur. This is what the ship looked like. This is the etching that was given to honoured guests at the launch. There's a copy of this etching in the museum in Warrington, and I was also shown a copy that was in the hands of the current members of the Moore family, who were the ship owners. And remarkably for a Liverpool-owned ship, or for a Liverpool ship, the Moore family were in Mooresfort, which is Latin in Tipperary near Limerick Junction. And intriguingly, they told me that at one time, perhaps back in the 1940s, there was an outhouse down there with a whole load of ships' models. Doubtless the models of the ships owned by the Moore family. The Moore family leased most of their ships, or at least a lot of their ships at least, to the White Star Line, which was then Pilkington and Wilson's White Star Line, which went bust about 10 years later, and the name and the goodwill and the house flag, the White Star on the mast there, on the red ground, was taken over by the company later that owned the Cunard White Star Line of later years, and the White Star Line that owned the Titanic, and all the other ships whose name ended up in "ic." So you the Baltic, the Laurentic, and so on. So just an idea of Lambay Island and its shipwrecks, because the Tayleur is shown here in Tayleur Bay. Around here you have the Shamrock, yes, at Carrickdorish Rock. Over here you have the Will o' the Wisp and the Strath Tay. The French trawler, as it's known, the Rose Mystique. Somewhere in Broad Bay, Saltpan Bay, is the Pioneer. And on the reef that runs in towards the shore, there's the Una, the Shamrock, the Albion, and the Tom. Over this side, probably near Kiln Point, was the Richard and Martha, a ship taking supplies to the Williamite army in Carrickfergus from Hoylake near Chester, which was also wrecked on Lambay, but the cannons were salvaged and brought ashore. So altogether, the Lambay Island is quite an obstruction, particularly to vessels approaching Dublin from the north. Now the Tayleur uniquely wasn't like that, but we'll see the course of that in a moment. Charles Tayleur owned the Tayleur Foundry at Warrington. He lived at a place called Roddington Hall, and the pub opposite is called the Tayleur Arms, along with the picture of the Tayleur. This absolutely denies the story that the ship is called the John Tayleur, but that's another story. The foundry was particularly well situated between 3 railway lines and bordering on the River Mersey. And this is a bill of materials for the construction of the ship. You can't really read it, it's just that's the original document, but everything is down there in pounds, shillings and pence, from nuts and bolts to nails, to planks of wood, to sheets of iron. The situation on the railway lines became very important and was the purpose of the Tayleur foundry, because it was built to make locomotives for the Stevenson concern, whose main place was in Newcastle on Tyne, and at a time when you had neither railways nor locomotives strong enough to get over the Pennines, they wanted an alternative site for building the locomotives, and this was where they chose Warrington. The company went through various phases. It ended up being owned by English Electric, the diesel firm, and they moved their business to Newton-le-Willows, and the ship's model is recorded as being in Newton-le-Willows around the time that the English Electric closed down there. Newton-le-Willows was an enormous works, made the Deltic diesels, which effectively took over from steam engines in England in the 1960s, and was later taken over by MAN Diesel, the German company, and eventually closed. The Tayleur foundry in Warrington built the Matilda tanks during the Second World War, and it also built components and ironwork for many of the major engineering constructions in England, bridges and so on. It did not make the tubes for the Britannia Bridge, that is sometimes said, but it may have made components for other bridges in the vicinity. It was designed by William Rennie. He was a shipbuilder and designer, and he was also a member of the Compass Committee, which is very significant. This was the committee that researched compasses and magnetism for ships. The Tayleur had a number of innovative features. One of them was a steering mechanism, which is in, it's on display in Rush Mill, the Skerries Mills. And this was a labour-saving device. And a lot of the innovation relating to the Tayleur was labour-saving and crew-saving. And there was remarks made that the crew was very small for a ship of its size. But you see, it had a donkey engine to assist with raising and lowering the sails, which was novel. It had this steering mechanism to assist with the steering, and you've seen how you might have 6 men on the wheel of a ship in a severe gale trying to keep it straight and keep it on the right course. But this had this gearing mechanism and innovative mechanism. The idea was that the clipper ship was to be towed out of Liverpool by a tug, which it was, and when it set sail for Australia, it would have runs at sea of as many as 3,000 miles. And so it wasn't like a warship that would be tacking and weaving and changing sails and optimizing speed and all the rest of it with a huge crew. And that's one of the things that are misunderstood. One of the passengers gave evidence at the inquest that the crew was very short-handed, but he was an ex-Navy man, used to having 300 men on a frigate scrubbing the decks and the like, and whiling away the hours, whereas this was a commercial ship manned at the minimum level and taking advantage of whatever could be done. There was another comment made about the rudder of the Tayleur, that it was inadequate, and it was part of the reason why the ship couldn't steer easily. But the rudder that I've pictured here is the rudder on the Cutty Sark, and to all intents and purposes, when compared with the rudder on the ship's model, they seem to be of equivalent size, so it wasn't a particularly small rudder. These are the lines of the ship drawn from the model, more of which anon. Originally, the Tayleur was to sail on the 20th of October 1853. The Tayleur was built very quickly. She was only laid down in May and was intended to sail not much more than 6 months later. And these are the advertising notices for the sailing. for Melbourne. So the first sailing notice suggests that it was going to go on the 20th of November. It's not clear if they didn't have enough passengers or if it wasn't ready, but it was being readied all the time in Liverpool. And then eventually there were later sailing notices, and eventually it sailed at the end of January. Incidentally, this is a Dublin sailing notice, and you'll notice that the co-agent or the agent is Nichols, who were on 20 Eden Quay. And they'd have been Nichols, the coal merchants, well into the 1970s. I think they were amalgamated into Coal Distributors Limited. This is a Belfast agent, Charlie and Malcolm. And this is one of the features. There were different agents everywhere from Derry to Newcastle to Liverpool, though Pilkington and Wilson probably dealt with the matters in Liverpool themselves. But there are different brokers' lists, and the passenger list that is mentioned with some of the lower numbers is described as the brokers' list. But the snag is, did they manage to get all the brokers? I reckon there was even a broker in Limerick, because there was a number of passengers from Clare. And notwithstanding all of that, there were passengers from France and from Germany. So what broker's list did they appear on is a question. You know, had they a through passage or whatever? And that's part of the confusion about the number of people aboard. As I've said, Moore of Tipperary were the ship owners, and they were charterers to Pilkington and Wilson's White Star, and both the White Star flag and motto continued on into the reformed company that ultimately owned the Titanic and the other big liners of the 1900s. There was a Lloyd's survey done on the ship, and this gives us a lot of information. They measured the thickness of all the plates, bars, supports and struts, and this is still done today for something like oil tankers, because when corrosion occurs in, say, an oil tanker, some of the metal is rusted away, weakened and so on. And to maintain your Lloyd's A1 classification for insurance, everything has to be in good order. And the classification is very important for insurance because your premium is doubled, or else you end up as one of these ghost ships like the Russians are running around with the oil at the moment. They are old ships, they're dodgy, they probably only have a single bottom. In fact, they're a massive risk. But a Lloyd's insurance syndicate would only insure a ship that was A1. Many of the older ships that weren't insurable under that sort of category would be travelling without insurance. The owners would have to take the risk themselves, and the shippers might be able to insure the cargo, but again, the premium would be higher, and that's the importance of the Lloyd's survey. But this gives us a lot of information about the length of the ship, the breadth of the ship, and so on, and how it was fitted out. But it was fitted out, and it was classified as the best possible classification. Just an aerial view of Lambay. You've seen the diagrammatic view. The cliffs on this east side, where the Tayleur ran in, are pretty high. They are not unclimbable, but in a storm with waves washing up, it wouldn't be an easy job, and it wasn't. This is a proposal for the course of the Tayleur, drawn by Enda Mulvihill, who looked at the various markings and evidence and so on. And it seems that the actual course of the ship was way north of where it intended to be. But if it was on its intended course, it would have run into the Kish Bank. The course was very northerly. They said they saw the Calf of Man lighthouse. Cormac has an idea that they may have seen the Holbolan light at Carlingford Loch. But the reason for being so far north is always put down to the compasses. But there were several effects at play. The first was that when the Great Britain ran ashore at Dundrum Bay, it had been swept northwards, having coming out of Liverpool, by the set of the tide, which is particularly strong at certain tides. And so therefore there's no reason to believe that the Tayleur wasn't also pushed northerly off its course in the same way. The Great Britain went ashore up here. The second thing was that because of the sails and the way they were, there was possibly a slotting effect. Just as an aircraft wing gives lift, the sails of a ship can give a slotting effect to the side. Now, who am I to talk to sailors about slotting effect of sails? But the bottom line is that the slotting effect could have driven the ship again north of where it intended to be. The ship had 3 compasses. They all disagreed. One of the problems was that an iron steamer and Dr. Cunningham's metal building for a surgery and a house had been loaded as deck cargo after the compasses had been swung. Unlike a warship, the Tayleur did not have an azimuth compass that could be read through a prism but was placed at the top of the mast as far away from the iron hull as would have the minimum influence. And this is a bit of an omission because this was a state-of-the-art ship designed and built by members of the Compass Committee who must have been aware of best practice. The compasses had been swung. There's Mr. Grantham supervised the swinging of the compasses. He was also a member of the Compass Committee. But how they missed having the compass on the mast, just you don't know. But one way or the other, the ship was off course, and this is a description of how the ship skidded into Lambay. They saw Lambay. There was a mist, there was a heavy breeze behind them. They tried to slow themselves down, but the anchor chain, they dropped the anchors, but the anchor chain snapped, and I reckon that the ship literally skidded across the bay to end up in there. It hit Lambay by the skin of its teeth, so to speak. 50 or 100 yards and it would have escaped, probably. It was also being driven by the wind, obviously, but also by the tide. And anyone who's dived on the site, and I know most of you have, well, a good many of you have, you may have encountered the current there, which is truly, truly ferocious. And I've actually been swept right out here by an amazing current. That's the only way to describe it. And I've checked the state of the tide, and it would have been the peak of the current. That possibly explains why it was driven in sideways into the shore. Other problems related to the ship having a large turning circle. But I believe that the main cause of the accident was that the Tayleur was significantly faster than they anticipated. Now, there's very little evidence of them putting out a log to judge their speed. There was a fog, and they didn't know how far across the Irish Sea they were. There's a whole load of other factors thrown in. Captain Noble had a bad fall, fell down through 2 decks when the ship was being built about six weeks before it was launched. So some people say maybe he had a bang in the head. Certainly subsequently he had a drink problem. He died only 3 or 4 years after the Tayleur. He had gone back to sea, he had taken a ship to Australia, but he died and was buried in Toxteth in Liverpool. So there's any one of a number of speculative reasons. But the Commission of Inquiry restored his master's certificate, which of course had been lost on the ship, barely a year after the Tayleur accident, so he was not blamed. The only 2 things in the inquiry was that he hadn't taken soundings and he hadn't run a log. So all pointing to that they were further across the Irish Sea than they anticipated. There is evidence that during the tow out from Liverpool, that the Tayleur started to put up sail and overran the tugboat, at which stage it was released. And that again points to an amazing speed, perhaps unexpected. This is the bell of the Tayleur. It's now in the National Museum, but it's not on display. It was on display for, well, a couple of months, but then it went into the depths of the museum. This is part of the cargo of the Tayleur. There were headstones, and there were either grave surrounds or mantelpieces, it's disputed. These are quite large lumps of slate, and this again was part of the economy of a ship going to Australia. Instead of taking up a whole load of stones and rubble and putting them in the bottom of the ship as ballast, you put in something that was useful out in Australia. So the lower decks were filled with slate, mantelpieces, headstones, and then there was a lot of ironmongery, ploughs, agricultural implements, and so on. The Tayleur had at least 5 anchors. 2 of them, as we've seen, were lost in the attempts to slow down the ship, and the 2 bower anchors were recovered by the Sub-Aqua Club in Rush, and one is on the shore at Loch Shinny and the other in Rush Town. There was another anchor sold at the auction of the effects salvaged from the Tayleur. There was a lot of salvage done on the Tayleur. Interestingly, a man out in Rush there back in February told me that his father, who was then in a nursing home and ill, described being taken out by his grandfather, or no, maybe his grandfather described, but anyway, that it was possible at very low states of the tide to stand on the deck of the Tayleur after it was wrecked. So the water there is about 17 meters deep. The ship is quite high. Remember, when the Tayleur was wrecked, the mast still stood up, except for one mast that fell over or was cut over, which would be a normal thing to do, and people escaped ashore on it. But it was easily found at the time, and according to this man, you could stand on the deck. This is the notice for the auction of the effects of the Tayleur. So there was a very extensive salvage operation, and this gives you some idea of the cargo. Bales of alpaca, lustered and cobalt cloths, bale of blankets, loose bales of carpets, horse cloths, rugs, bales of canvas, immense quantity of china. Well, you know, some of you have seen the china. In fact, I forgot to bring a plate tonight. Carpenters and smiths' tools, but this was absolutely everything that was needed out in Australia, down to Dr. Cunningham's surgery and a prefabricated house. You see the sellers then, like these are firms that were prominent in Dublin shipping. You apply to Palgrave and Company, 17 Eden Quay. Eden Quay was all shipping companies. That's Palgrave Murphy's in later life. And then the brokers and auctioneers are Stokes, Widow and Sons. Stokes, of course, was an accountancy firm in later life. Stokes, Kennedy, Crowley, SKC and all the rest of it. And their address is Commercial Buildings, Dame Street, which was a large office block of the time, replaced mostly by the Central Bank building. There's just a portion of it to the side, to the, as you look at the Central Bank building, the right-hand side building is a reconstruction of the commercial buildings that used to be there well up to the 70s. So a lot of Dublin connections there. And then, of course, there's spars, rigging, etc. for a ship of 3,000 tons. So quite an amount of material salvaged. One account says that divers inspected the hull on behalf of the Inspector of Iron Ships. And names of the divers aren't given, but doubtless they also assisted in the salvage of what was recovered from the Tayleur. But there is just a tantalising account of diving on the wreck in May of 1854, so barely 3 months after the ship was wrecked. That wouldn't have been now totally unusual for the time, because helmet diving was well developed by 1854. These are pictures of some of the crockery involved. There was a number of designs and plates, and people have looked into this. So you have a willow pattern, and this one is known as baronial halls of East Stowe. The top one is bamboo pattern. There were wine bottles as well, beer bottles. This is a set of crockery that, I forget whose set this is, but again you see the different patterns, and yet another set, and they were all stamped J and MPB. That's J and MP Bell of Glasgow, and remarkably, though the wreck was in 1854, these were of 1844 pattern. So they've been in storage somewhere for 10 years. And many of them have a damaged mark in the center of the China mark. And that's a sign of seconds. Even today, if you buy seconds at a sale, they will have an impact mark in the center of the pottery mark. So this was secondary stuff that wasn't sold in England and was going out to the colonies. Now, some of the pottery, some of the fancier stuff may have been personal possessions of people who were traveling, because the people who were traveling were not penniless famine immigrants. It was not a government assisted passage ship. These people had all paid for their passage, except for a number of the stewards aboard who were working their passage. And Dr. Cunningham, that I've mentioned, the ship's surgeon, was also working his passage. And we know this because they were signed on for a shilling. So in return for providing medical services, Dr. Cunningham and his 8 or 10 children and his wife all travelled because he was working his passage. One of the stories associated with the Tayleur actually pans out, and a child was found on the deck of the ship when people were escaping from the ship, and it's presumed that his parents were washed overboard because they were nowhere to be seen and they were never seen again. A Frenchman took up the child in his mouth by his teeth, holding the clothing, and scrambled across a rope to the shore, which wasn't very far when the ship originally struck, and saved the child. This baby became known as the orphan child and got a lot of publicity. And in the spirit of the time, the Freeman's Journal didn't cover it much. It was the story of the orphan child is mostly in the Saunders newsletter. And there's a perfect good reason for that. The Freeman's Journal was an O'Connellite Catholic paper, and the child was being minded by Mr. Armstrong, the rector in Malahide, who clearly had a direct line, just as the Irish Times, to the Saunders newsletter. And so the Saunders newsletter rose a fund for this child and followed its progress, and is the only place where the sad news is reported that Arthur Charles Griffiths died in Hereford, having been taken back to England by his grandmother about 6 weeks after the Tayleur wreck. And I contacted the registrar in Hereford, who sent me a photocopy, and it clearly states, and there's a bit of commentary on the death registration, saying that this was the orphan child from the Tayleur, which ties up the story perfectly. It's very interesting. There are sometimes comments written in on the registration of death and or burial, which can be extremely revealing. Normally, the registration is a bland document that tells you little or nothing. But for instance, down in Kerry, the victims of the Ballyseedy mine explosion, there are comments, one of which says, Humphrey Murphy said a trap mine. Completely revealing, but we'll not go into that story. That's a story for some other time. But if it was a trap mine, it wasn't a mine planted by the Free State, it was a mine planted by the irregulars. And that's the implication of that. But it's just that sometimes it's always worth going to look at the original document because it might say something. The passenger manifest, I've mentioned that there was a lot of doubt about how many were on board. Effectively, the inquest recorded that the clearance clerk said 576, and we know that 282 were saved, which makes 294 lost. And the clearance list was assembled by the local brokers as discussed. Captain Walker at the inquiry says that there appeared to have been 13 saloon, 445 steerage, 70 crew, that's 515. Now you see, immediately there, you begin to wonder what's in and what's out. The Walker inquiry says 70 crew, so the crew are in. I know that 70 crew doesn't cover the 6 apprentices. Then another paper says that 256 were English, 73 Scottish and 111 Irish. 39 others, that's 479. Another discrepancy. Saunders newsletter says no list. A Warrington paper though says that there were 640 aboard. The Dictionary of Disasters at Sea, which was a Lloyd's publication, would have been derived from Lloyd's information, and it says 652 aboard. I then compiled lists of every name that I could find in the different accounts and just checked them off one by one. And I have 677 names. But then a recent blog on the Tayleur on YouTube mentions names of people that I don't have on my list, adding another 6. And I know that my list of 677 is missing the 6 apprentices that I knew about but forgot about or forgot to include because they were mentioned in Emily Madden's thesis on the Tayleur. So all told there, that brings you up about, what is it, 612 more, 680, 89. It's quite a mystery. The Illustrated London News says it has accommodation for 680 passengers. And again then, the anomalies that come in is, like one man is saying that it had so many passengers. Well, that means they weren't crew. Then we know there were 60 or so children on board. But were they passengers as documented? In other words, were they travelling free with their parents? It goes on like that. Then you could have confusion by people who are working their passage and who are stewards. Now they're down on the crew list and you know they're working their passage because their pay is a shilling. So that's how the anomalies occur. And when somebody says passengers, well, does that not mean crew? Lives aboard, well, that includes everybody. Were the children counted at all? It's a mess. These were hardy people. 86 of them went out on the next White Star ship only a month later. This was the Golden Era. And they arrived in Australia, and indeed a number of relatives, descendants of theirs, have been in touch with me. I've come across, I think, at least 6 relatives who all had a little bit of information, had various stories and so on. These are some underwater photographs of the Tayleur. The quality of the photographs is particularly bad because it's a very murky site. All the mud and silt from Dublin port accumulates because of the tides in that vicinity, and the sea bottom is very fluid, and once stirred up, the visibility goes pitch black. It's probably best dived after a really good easterly gale, though sand may have been driven up on top of the wreck at that stage and may obscure parts of it. it's quite remarkable the amount of the ship that's exposed sometimes and how little is exposed at other times. That's the location. You can see the cliffs there. Like I say, they're very high. You wouldn't try to climb the sheer slope here, but this is just about climbable. This is a side scan sonar of the wreck. The contrast isn't very good here. You can see the bow of the ship up towards the top, and there's just traces here of the mast. The metal mast is still visible out on the wreck. It's about the diameter of an oil drum and hollow. That's a device that used to be on the top of the mast for running lines through. It's like a wheel with 4 segments in it, if you can see it. That's a cast iron pillar, probably supporting the upper decks. Slates, roof slates. That's a portion of the mast. That's the outline of one of the headstones. They're described as a Quaker pattern. I don't know if that means much to me. They just look perfectly normal to me. That's the way the headstones are stacked on each other. More slates. This is what a compass of the period looked like. I think I won't go into describing how a compass works and how you adjust the compass by means of the gimbals, but this is how a compass would be swung and how its needle direction would be adjusted to true. The inquest was held in the Grand Hotel in Malahide. Very conveniently, Mr. Davis was the coroner and also owned the hotel, so any business was worth having. For the purposes of the inquest, 2 bodies were brought ashore in Dublin from Lambay, because you couldn't have an inquest at the time without having a body on the table in front of you. And so the bodies that were brought ashore at Dublin was a boy with a wooden leg and the second mate, Mr. Cooley. Again, the purpose was that the bodies could be named and identified. So other passengers had put names on those 2. And then yet another body was brought ashore by boat from Lambay in case the other bodies didn't get there for the inquest. And this was the son, the youngest son of Dr. Cunningham. The inquest took about 3 days. There was evidence taken in all cases, and it reached the conclusion that it was death due to shipwreck, which was all that was required of that inquiry. The 2 bodies that came ashore from Dublin, Cooley and the boy with the wooden leg, were buried at the Church of Ireland, Malahide. Local lore says that they were buried to the front of the church, where there's a lawn nowadays, but there's no information on that and there's no surviving documentation. There was a man who used to take tours around Malahide, and he would explain to you, do you see, the bodies were buried under the path. The Chinese men. You see, they weren't Christians. And on hearing this for the second time, I asked him, did they bury them alive? And he said, no, why would they do that? Because the Chinese survived to die. They were the first ashore and they ran to the Dockrell household for assistance. But that didn't stop him telling a good story, and at some talk later I heard him tell the same thing again. So never let the truth get in the way of a good story. The same wretch showed a photograph, I'm not sure if I have it later, but it showed an inquest of the Tayleur victims on the beach on Lambay. And Roy Stokes, who's here, and Cormac and myself all looked at this photograph. Oh yeah, well the story about the photograph is that I knew this photograph existed, and the man had in the meantime died, And I managed to find out the address of the widow, and I contacted the widow, and I know she didn't really want to go through the husband's effects and all the rest of it. And about a year later, I contacted her again and said, look, I really wanted to see that photograph. And so I got the photograph, and well, when I got it, we all agreed, no, that wasn't anywhere on Lambay that we knew. You see, this was an authentic photograph. There was a man in it with a stovepipe hat, and that was Mr. Cusack, Lord Talbot's agent, because there's a photograph of him standing on the steps of Malahide Castle. Now, this added verisimilitude to an otherwise bald and unconvincing narrative. And time passed, I put the photograph away. And then Richard Larne sent me a booklet about shipwrecks in Cornwall. And here is the very photograph. Inquest on the beach at Tregaddador in Cornwall on the victims of the wreck of the Sarah Jane. The Chancellor had just produced a photograph and flashed it up, and nobody would know any better. Mind you, you've no idea, of course, whether any of these photographs are authentic or not either. That's another one. This was Noble Cert. He took the Earl of Sefton to Australia in 1855 and died in Liverpool in 1861, aged only 35. He was very young, he was only 29, and was an extra master and considered one of the better ship's captains in Liverpool, chosen to take out a brand new ship to Australia. He had previously taken ships to California in the gold rush there. So he was considered the best of his time, and very highly regarded, best places in exams and all the rest of it. And his cert was restored, so there was no real blame attached to him. And he's buried at Toxteth in Liverpool. I've passed through Toxteth, and I'm told that the ambulance men in Toxteth wear flak jackets. These again are compasses of the period. There was an RNLI medal awarded, silver medal, to the Coast Guard and Chief Boatman, George Finlay, and £1 each to his 4-man crew for their services in saving 2 of the crew of the ship. They went out the following day and took 2 people off the masts of the ship. To climb up the masts was a standard way of saving yourself in a shipwreck, and indeed they would even tie themselves to the masts in the hope that the rocket rescue apparatus could be got out to the masts and that they could get ashore on the Breeches Buoy. And so 2 survivors did do that. They were very lucky not to die of hypothermia because it was February, January indeed, and there was a storm blowing, but in any case they were rescued the following day, and Finlay was given a silver RNLI medal for it. Tayleur medals were struck for, there was a fund raised to assist the survivors, and they were given clothing and the like. They were shipped to Liverpool, and they were offered a free passage on the next ship by White Star, and they were given food and so on. Small amounts were repaid to people who had produced food on the spot and shipped it out to Lambay. So for instance, there's an account that Lord Talbot sent out a steward with so many bags of oatmeal, a couple of sheep, and lots of whiskey. And similarly, other big houses in the area sent provisions out immediately. They were recompensed to some extent. And then there was a residue of the fund, and it was set up to award medals for life-saving in the Irish Sea. And some of these medals are around. I've seen quite a few of them. There's one in the Maritime Museum, there's one in the National Museum. A man, Clement McGann, has 4 of them, I think. And there's a man in England who's into life-saving medals, has maybe another 4. And there's one in the possession of the Coast Guard. It used to be on display in a side window in Hove, or was for a time there. And I'm just thinking, I'm not aware of any others in private hands, though 1 or 2 have come up for auction from time to time. William Fiennes is the man that the Coast Guards have his medal. It depicts the Tayleur shipwreck, and indeed there's been a painting done based on that illustration. I think that could well be the illustration from the Illustrated London News as well. There are very few Tayleur victims buried anywhere. There's the two, as we mentioned, in St Andrew's Church in Malahide. The Cunningham boy was taken back to Petharty by his uncle. Never managed to trace that grave. Then a man was washed ashore in Malahide called Robert Boyd, and he was from Ballymena, and he was buried at Kirkanola churchyard. And there were 76 bodies on the shore awaiting burial, as described by Mr. Walker in the Liverpool Courier. Walker had come across to try to find the body of some in-law of his, as far as I know. And he went back to Liverpool. Transport between Dublin and Liverpool was pretty easy at the time. A person could be across in 24 hours, and the news went to Liverpool inside 24 hours as well. So, you know, Ireland was not a remote place, and because of the frequency of ferries and shipping, even in 1854, it was possibly easier even than nowadays to get forward and back. You would have had several sailing. There's a plaque in Tissaran Church in Banner to this man, Francis Lestrange. It merely says that he, Arthur Lestrange, it just says lost at sea, but the date corresponds, and we know there was a Lestrange on the Tayleur. This is a weird one. This is a memorial card, which I was given a copy of, and it is in memory of Thomas Stott and Sarah, his wife. And it says clearly that they were on the Tayleur, but there is no account in any newspaper that I could find, nor on any list. So I've sort of added them to my list, but that's the only evidence that they ever existed. So that's why I lend a great deal of credibility to a new name that crops up. And in this YouTube video that only came up on screen there in the last couple of weeks, it was just before I was preparing this, that I just checked to see was there anything interesting. And there was this American sounding lady, gave a talk on the Tayleur, and then mentioned names, and mentioned a child who was saved, a girl aged 11, which rings more or less true, but both her parents were lost. And she had an Irish sounding name, which I couldn't trace in any of my lists. And similarly, there was another name given, and there had been another two members of family with them, and their name doesn't appear on my list. So I'm not saying for a moment that despite the fact that I have a good many more names than most agree were on board the Tayleur, that I can add another 6 in the last week or two. Now, I've asked them for the provenance of their names, just to see is there some source that I haven't tapped, because despite it being 20 odd years since I prepared the book, in fact exactly 20 years since I prepared the book, you always, the minute you have published a book, you open a file, additional material, and that file runs to about 30 pages now. This is yet another interesting one that turned up, I'm not sure where. This letter survives, and it relates, it's in 1863, and this Robert Middleton died on the Tayleur, was lost at sea, nobody found, and his solicitor is writing to the White Star Line, asking them to confirm that he was on the ship, so that he could be presumed dead legally after not being seen for 10 years. I don't know what the statutory period is, 7 or 10 years or something like that. And I think this letter must have been in the files in Liverpool, I'm not sure where. That's the photograph allegedly on the beach in Lambay, but definitely identified as being on the beach in Cornwall. This chest with the name Holland, because the name Holland made nothing to me, but I was assured that this was fabricated as a scam by some scuba divers, because there was great mileage in Tayleur artifacts at the time, and somebody made up this sea chest allegedly and claimed that there was treasure in it and the whole damn works. But the laugh of all that is that that was all forgotten, and it came up for auction in London. This is the John Tayleur, broken up in 1843, and the Liverpool newspapers picked up the name John Tayleur because I reckon that this was the only Tayleur that was in Lloyd's register. The Tayleur never appeared in the published Lloyd's register because it was launched after the 1853 edition was produced, and it was sunk before the 1854 edition was produced. Now, doubtless Lloyd's had a record of its insurance and so on, but it was never in the Lloyd's register. And this ship then was presumed to be the Tayleur. There was a painting of it, and the papers picked up the name. And then once it was picked up, it was the custom at the time for newspapers to lift stories from another newspaper. Now, they very often did it quite legitimately and with acknowledgement. So a country paper like the Nina Guardian would pick up a story from a Dublin paper or from a London paper or from a Kerry paper and publish it with acknowledgement. So, but the Liverpool papers anyway repeated the error. This is why I'm so interested in the repetition of errors and the repetition and confirmation and affirmation of erroneous material. And again, to use another example, you have all heard of the Cairo Gang, the British Secret Service in Dublin in 1920s. The name the Cairo Gang does not exist before 1958. It's the fabrication of an Express journalist called Rex Taylor, who published a book, Michael Collins, and mentioned the Cairo Gang. The proof of this is that there's absolutely no mention of it in hundreds of witness statements, though there's lots of mention of the Igo Gang. And in Dan Breen's My Fight for Irish Freedom, it ran to 4 editions. No mention in the 1930 edition, no mention in the 1940 edition, no mention in the 1950 edition, and then the lie is perpetrated by introducing it into the 1963 edition. But like, who could doubt Dan Breen's word? He mentions the Cairo Gang and tells the story as copied from Rex Taylor. And every scribbler since has copied the story. But this is how never let the truth get in the way of a good story. There was a Cairo Cafe in Dublin. So that's the Tayleur, and I'll switch over to Cormac now to talk about the model.
Thank you. Yeah. Now, that's Eddie showed you this already. This is the designer of the Tayleur, William Rennie, a famous Scottish ship designer and a shipbuilder. No relation whatever to John Rennie, who designed Dunleary Harbour. There was a lot of confusion about that. A lot of people thought it was the same person. But a lot of what Eddie spoke about there, Chinese whispers have arisen about the Tayleur and how the Tayleur came to grief and various faults that were in it. But it's very highly unlikely that William Rennie would have had any inherent faults built into the ship. He was a 4th generation shipbuilder in Aberdeen, and he later owned a big shipyard at the time of the Tayleur in Liverpool. So I'd say the Tayleur was a state-of-the-art vessel in every respect. I can find the button now. Here we go. It's not the right one. Where are we? Here we go. That's a painting I did of the Tayleur for a friend of mine. I was doing a building job for her at the time, and she wanted that painting for over her fireplace, so it's still hanging there, I'm glad to say. But I brought along the original builder's model, half model of the Tayleur, and it's on the table over here. And I just want to talk a little bit about it, because practically every piece of metal on the ship was gotten from this half model. Virtually every ship that was ever built, including very small boats up to great big sailing ships and steamers and liners. Even the Titanic, the lines of the Titanic were gotten from a half model like this until such time as they were superseded by computer technology. It's all done by computers now, but up till very recently, this was how they got the lines of all vessels. And the way it was done was, there was a block made and it was dry dowled together in layers. And the layers could then be taken asunder and laid down on paper and marked. And the lines, particularly all the shape, the body plan, the shape of the frames was the most important thing. They were stood up in a line along the keel. And then the ship was either planked or plated, as the case may be. This came into my possession, and I took the lines of the ship off this. Now, I had to do it in the reverse way, because as a general rule, when these half models were finished with, when the lines had been taken and committed to paper, they were then scaled up onto a great big floor called a lofting floor, and patterns were made for the different frames and stuff like that. But you can get a huge amount of information from the lines. Now, the ship was acquired by this gentleman here, an old friend of mine, Desi Brannigan. He left it to me in his will. So I came into it after he passed away. Now, he had originally lent it to, after he had it for a while, he lent it to the Civic Museum, the Corporation Museum in William Street. And it lay in there for a good length of time. And the man who found the bell had lent it for an exhibition that they held on the Tayleur, and they were both put into storage. But I went in and I rescued them because I was a member of the Old Dublin Society at the time who used the place. And it was in fairly bad condition, so I restored it fully. I partially restored it at the time I got it, and I took the lines from it, and I gave it back to Desi. And then, after he passed away, I did a full restoration on it there. And you can see it here, it's on the table. You can have a look at it later on. That's it the day I got it. I remember I got a dreadful dose of the flu the same day, sticks in my mind. But there's a solid silver plate on it. And this is what it says, and I'll show you the text of it now. You read it better this way. Anyway, this is what it says on it. The original model of the hull of the clipper ship Tayleur launched at Warrington, October the 4th, 1853, the first Ardent seagoing vessel. Now that's clearly in error. It wasn't the first Ardent seagoing vessel. There were plenty of Ardent vessels around at the time. So clearly the silver plate was put onto it at some later stage. I don't know exactly when or where come onto it, but this is one of the vessels that Eddie mentioned. The Great Britain was way bigger than the Tayleur, and it was built a good 10 years before the Tayleur was built. The Great Britain is still in existence. It's in the dry dock in Bristol, having been brought back from the Falkland Islands. But it went ashore in Dundrum, possibly for the same reasons that the Tayleur was in Dundrum Bay up near Dundalk. There's said to be a magnetic anomaly near Lambay, but there was certainly a great magnetic anomaly on a big Ardent ship. They simply weren't used to the idea of swinging the compasses and adjusting the compasses with various pieces of metal and magnets, as it's done nowadays. It's a very simple affair now. It's great, like everything else, it's easy when you know how to do it. But and then when a ship is built, they generally swing the ship to adjust the compasses. That simply means pointing the ship on a known compass heading and reading the compass down and noting the difference between the through heading and what it says on the compass, and adjustments are made accordingly, and tables are written for that and all that sort of thing. But the Great Britain was ultimately salvaged. This is a painting by Matthew Kendrick of the ship aground. Eisenbart Kingdom Brunel took over the salvage of it, and using an ingenious method of getting the ship afloat again. She was actually salvaged and converted into a sailing ship. And that's her there today in the dry dock that she was built in Bristol. But there was another vessel very similar to the Tayleur that got wrecked on the north coast of Wales in a place called Marlborough. Not all that long after the Tayleur. It was the Royal Charter. Ship very similar in size, but unlike the Tayleur, it had a steam engine in it. Now this brings me to the point that it has been said that the Tayleur was originally intended to have a steam engine, and that they simply couldn't get one in time, despite the fact that the Tayleur, the Vulcan Ironworks made locomotive engines. It would have been a totally different type of engine, and they simply weren't able to get a steam engine in time. So they carried on and changed the plan and made it into a pure sailing ship. The Royal Charter, that's a painting over there. She'd come back from a run to Australia, carrying people who had gone out for the gold rush, and there was a great deal of gold aboard it, in sovereigns that had been cast out there, bags of gold dust, bags of gold nuggets. And a lot of it was salvaged on the coast of Marlborough, but people still dive there and still find an odd gold nugget. A dreadful tragedy. He was just caught in a hurricane, had almost got as far as Liverpool when a huge hurricane sprung up and drove the ship in ashore in a very similar type of place to the Tayleur, in underneath cliffs, and it was wrecked with great loss of life. But I had to take the lines of the ship using a totally different method than taking it asunder, because the layers have all been glued up together, as you can see there. When they were finished with the models, they generally did that. They glued them up and put them on a backboard and maybe probably exhibited them in the shipyard office or in the office of the ship owners. And there are a great many of them knocking around today as antiques. So I had to do it using a totally different method to get the lines. I used a pattern tape. I'll show you one now in a moment. I had to delineate the places where the frames would have been with masking tape, and I had to take the outer shape then off the hull using a pattern taker and transfer them onto paper. That's the lines that I took there. So it was great getting them recorded, and I've sent them around to various museums, maritime museums and so forth, because there were no lines of the Tayleur intact other than the model itself. That's the thing that I use. That's a pattern taker. You just shove it against a curved surface and press all those little spikes in again, and it just, you can lay it down then on paper and draw whatever curve you get. It was a successful method for me at any rate, you know. But I want to just talk about a great deal of what I tend to call Chinese whispers have sprung up, as Eddie mentioned, and they just get repeated and repeated ad infinitum, and all of a sudden then they become the accepted wisdom. I'll tell you my favourite Chinese whisper story, just to illustrate the point. During the First World War, the Dublin Fusiliers were in the trenches, and the field telephones had gone down. There was an attack pending, and word had to be passed up the line to headquarters by word of mouth from one man to the next. And the message was, send up reinforcements, we're going to advance. And it was repeated and repeated up a few hundred yards back to headquarters. And by the time I got to headquarters, the message was, send up 3 and 4 we're going to a dance. So that's how things can happen. But I've never sailed on a square rig vessel. Mark there tells me he sailed on the Bellum, which was a square rigger owned by Guinnesses. What's it called today, Mark?
It's called the Bellum now.
The Bellum now. It was
the lady something or other, I think. Was it?
Eddie should know that. He goes knows. Anyway, nevertheless, I've never sailed on a square rigger, but I've done quite a lot of sailing on gaff rig vessels. And we all know, a lot of us here are sailors, we all know about tacking and sailing into the wind. It's very, very difficult for a square rig vessel to sail into the wind. Now, a finely tuned modern yacht can sail easily to within 2 points of the direction from which the wind is coming. In other words, the wind is coming this way, you can sail to within about 2 points of the direction from which the wind is coming. A point on a compass is 11¼ degrees. 2 points is 22½ degrees. So a square rig vessel at its very best could only sail about 2 points into the wind. And some of them not even do that. And it's a known fact that most square rig vessels didn't actually tack. When you're going this way, if you want to go that way, to go ahead on this line here, you have to change course and actually zigzag along the line. But they didn't tack because it was a very, very difficult maneuver to carry out. It had to be done with split-second timing by a very well-trained crew and a very experienced crew. Now that seemingly wasn't the case with the Tayleur. One way or another they probably wouldn't have been tacking. I've read quite a lot about it just to do some research, and even in Royal Navy ships, except in the heat of battle where they had to tack, they generally, if they wanted to come about and go on the opposite tack, they actually wore the ship around. I'm going to explain what that means. It's a much more easy way of going on the opposite course to the one you're on. And I think that's what happened with the Tayleur. Now, in an ideal world, on the day that the Tayleur got wrecked, this was probably the course that they would have been on. The wind was blowing very strong southeasterly along that line there. They cast off the tug just off Anglesey, and if they were sailing 2 points into the wind, they would have been gone over in that direction there. But I reckon that they weren't 2 points into the wind, they were probably only about a point into the wind, because in one of the accounts afterwards, at the Board of Trade inquiry, I think it was the mate of the ship said that they sighted the Calf of Man light. Now the Calf of Man light has 2 lights, one above the other, and they revolve. I thought at first that they may have sighted the lighthouse that's at the entrance to Carlingford Loch. But no, when I read Eddie's account in his book, Eddie incidentally has written a very fine book about the wreck of the Tayleur. Yeah, I don't suppose you've any with you tonight, Eddie.
Unfortunately,
Bound for Australia. You'll probably be able to get it on eBay or contact Eddie directly. But at any rate, in his evidence to the inquiry, he said that they sighted the Calf of Man light, which meant that they were actually heading up in kind of in that direction there. So there are 2 lighthouses on the Calf of Man, one above the other, and they're aligned north and south. You can actually use them as leading marks if you're heading up that way. You know you're heading dead north up for the Calf of Man if they're in line, one above the other. Just go back there one. As I say, in an ideal world, they would have come 2 points into the wind and come over here somewhere, then change tack and head down this way. Change tack again over for Wexford and the Tusker, and then down, ultimately to get off Finisterre and down towards the Bay of Biscay and down to the Cape of Good Hope. That's the route they would have taken. But tacking a square rig ship requires split-second timing of swinging the yards around the mast. It has to be done almost simultaneously. You're going this way, and the order goes out to change tack and go over this way. You have to have a well-trained, well-tuned crew with a lot of people. There are ropes on the ends of the yards here called guys, controlled by blocks and tackle, and you have to swing the yard around the mast to trim it to take the wind on the other side. But it simply wasn't done, as far as I know, from all of the accounts I've read. If you read a great book by a man called Alan Villiers, who sailed on some of the last of the great big cargo carrying grain ships that were owned in Mariehamn, going from Australia back to the UK, he reckons that they hardly ever tacked. Some of those great big grain ships had a lot of German naval cadets aboard, and occasionally the master would tack just as an exercise. Most times when they came about, they actually wore the ship around. And wearing the ship around, instead of you're going this way, instead of just going directly over that way, you actually turn right around and you come round onto the wind in a much more controlled fashion. Normally you're going up this way, you're heading that way, and you tack to go over that way. But in wearing, you have to fall off and come around in a much more gradual fashion like that. I've actually done it on the Galway hooker that I crewed on, and it's a nice experience to do that instead of tacking. So I reckon that's what was happening with the Tayleur. They were simply the ropes, the various ropes and blocks were said to be stiff. The vessel had been hurried out, essentially. Get it out, get it earning money, get it out to sea. And it has been said several times, I don't think as a Chinese whisper, I think it was probably true, that the ropes were tight in the blocks. They were a scratch crew, they were unfamiliar with each other. It's not to say they were inefficient, but they simply weren't trained to that particular ship and to each other. So they probably wouldn't have been able to react as quickly and as efficiently as they would have if they were together perhaps for about a year, or maybe on the way back from Australia, or whatever. So I think what actually happened was, when the visibility was very bad, and they were on attack coming down this way and sighted Lambay and tried to wear the ship around. Now if they had been able to attack coming down that way, they would have been able to go in that direction. But in wearing the ship around, I think that's what happened. The current and the wind brought them into that little cove there, Lambay, in Tayleur Cove. Incidentally, the first divers that found the Tayleur back in the 1950s, they didn't know where it was. Nobody actually knew where it was locally, except there's a story that local lobster fishermen used to bring up lobsters with brown stains on them from the rust on the ship. But in actual fact, it was marked on several old charts and old maps. It's called Tayleur Bay, if they had taken the time to look. Anyway, they found it eventually, and literally tons and tons of the cargo were brought up. I'll show you some of that now in a moment. But I think that's what actually happened. In addition to the fact that the compasses seem to have been off, the compasses were swung, but compasses and iron vessels were a combination that was literally in its infancy back then. It moved on greatly, of course, after that. It was said that the crew were inefficient, and this was a statement in the Freeman's Journal, a very conservative paper, and very, very racist comments here. It said there were 10 able and active sailors and loads of half good for nothing Lascars and Chinamen and nondescript foreigners. You couldn't print that like that nowadays, you go to jail, and rightfully so. But that wasn't true at all. Like, there would have been just seamen who just simply weren't used to each other and used to the ship, a brand new ship that had been hurried out to sea without having proper sea trials. It was the era of the gold rush in Australia, and a lot of money to be made in carrying passengers and freight out of that particular thing. Equally, I don't think that this was an innovative screw type bit of steering gear. It's actually in the Maritime Museum in Dunleary. There was a lot of artefacts were taken on, they were given on loan to the Maritime Museum and taken back and given to Newbridge House out in Donabate, and they've been moved from there out to the Skerries Mills now, where there's some kind of a bit of a museum there. But I don't honestly believe that a designer and an engineer like Rennie would have put anything into a ship that was going to be flat, that wasn't going to work essentially. Because one of these Chinese whispers that has arisen was that the steering gear didn't work properly, or that the rudder was too small, that the sails, the masts were in the wrong position. I mean, if you look at the rudder on the model here and compare it to the drawings of the plans of various sailing ships of the same size, there's nothing whatsoever different from most of the rudders of the day, as Eddie has already pointed out. Rennie went on to build this ship here for the people who ultimately owned Lambay, one of the Baring family. It was built for Baring's Bank, the Norman Court, magnificent looking vessel. And one of the Barings ultimately owned Lambay, long after the wreck of the Tayleur. It was owned then by Lord Talbot de Malahide from Malahide Castle. That's another ship that he designed not too long after, that went on, had a very, very long sailing, like the Fiery Cross it was called, built in Liverpool. Now this is Jerry Bourne, an old friend of mine, and of Noel's as well, the man who found the bell of the Tayleur back in the early 1960s. Now it had been dived extensively up to that, because I think the first divers actually found the Tayleur in the mid-1950s at any rate. I'm not too sure the actual date. But Jerry found the bell, and he had it in his possession for a long time. He lent it to the Civic Museum, but before that, he and Desi Brannigan, who had the model, they had a Tayleur exhibition in Liberty Hall. And Jerry said he was walking into Liberty Hall and he met a fellow walking out with the bell under his arm. And Jerry said, "Where are you going with that?" He says, "I just wanted to bring it out to ring it." Well, he says, "You better bring it back inside or I'll ring it with your head." He told me that himself. And he would have been well capable of doing that, believe me. But I rescued them, as I say, I rescued the bell and the half model out of the Civic Museum. And before Jerry passed away, he asked me for the bell back because he wanted to leave it to the museum, and he did so. And it was on view in the foyer in a nice glass case for quite a long period, but it's not there now, as I checked. So it's probably just gone into storage and will probably never be seen again. These are some of Jerry's pals that he dived with back then. Now these were all spear fishermen as well as divers. Divers were a lot fitter then than they are now. Because they did a lot of spearfishing, which entailed a lot of swimming and breath holding, diving down on breath holding and waiting for a fish to come along to bang a spear into it. The names of them, some of the older divers you would probably recognise some of them. Some of them still around. And that's the bell there. A standard ship's bell. The requirement was for it to be a minimum of 12 inches across the bell mouth. It was used for signalling, various type of signals it was used for. A man on the lookout would give 1 ring for a ship dead ahead, 2 for starboard and 3 for port to whoever was on the helm or up on the bridge. And when the anchor would be getting weighed, once it was known to be off the bottom, it would be rung very quickly to let whoever was in charge know that the anchor was off the bottom. I got the bell and the half model on the same day. These are just a couple of paintings of ships of the period to let you know what this Tayleur would have looked like under full sail. It must have been a magnificent sight to see a ship like that with all sails set. It would have done up to about 17 knots. It was known that the Cutty Sark, for instance, often achieved that kind of speed with all sails set. Another one there. That's a man called Peter Mayman that Eddie got in touch with. His ancestor, he's from Australia. His ancestor was on the Tayleur when it was wrecked on Lambay Island. And he was saved. He was one of the people who got ashore. And he subsequently went out to Australia on board another vessel. And Peter and his wife came to Dublin, and Eddie brought them out to Lambay. Or he brought Peter out at any rate in the dive boat and showed him where the wreck took place. And he was delighted, absolutely chuffed. I gave him 2 plates off the Tayleur, the small one there and the big willow pattern one, and he was absolutely over the moon about that as well, I'll have to say. And I think that's the last one I have to show you, so thank you very much indeed. I'm sure we have a few questions to ask. Eddie, I'm sure be willing to answer any of your questions.
With the wind blowing as it was, why did they not bear away and go through the North Channel and
Good question, Paddy.
Maybe they didn't know the way. I don't know. It would have given them more sea room. It would have been a little bit longer.
I don't think it has ever arisen. I've never seen any reference to that, Paddy, in any of the subsequent inquiries. There were all kinds of inquiries and Board of Trade inquiries and inquests and all, and nobody ever asked that question, as far as I know.
Yeah,
the first one I've ever heard to ask that. It never even occurred to me.
With the prevailing wind from the southwest, the ships out of Liverpool must have frequently gone north and not south.
I would have thought so, yeah. North about. Well, like they knew where they were going, or where they thought they were going, actually, you know. But a number of factors combined to wreck the ship, and I don't think it was any one factor.
The only 2 things brought up in the Board of Trade inquiry was not taking soundings and not trading the log.
So they didn't know where they were.
Well, the visibility was very poor.
Yeah,
that came out also. That it was very overcast, and I think they were surprised to find they were so near. When land was finally sighted, that they were very surprised to find that they were almost up the top of Lambay.
I think it was said that some crews spotted waves or
hard breakers, probably.
breakers, yeah. I think
Sorry,
there's
there's just one other thing I wanted to show you, and I omitted it when I showed you the model. If I just go back there for a moment, it was something that didn't occur to me whenever I was actually taking the lines of the vessel. And it might have to do with the fact that it was said that the Tayleur was going to have an engine. It wasn't designed initially, or perhaps might have been designed initially for an engine. And it didn't really occur to me because of the fact that I drew out the lines. Each of this vessel is it's 1 in 48, a quarter of an inch to the foot is the scale that was used in it. So each of these layers represents 3 feet. And I marked off the drawing in layers 3/4 of an inch thick, each representing 3 feet. And I really didn't take into account the fact that from there up there are no layers. So only occurred to me later on that there might have been a question of that this was actually a secondary model that was got up to take account of the different configuration that would have been required for the stern. It wouldn't, if there was a steam engine going in there, there would have been a great arch in front of the propeller and a whole different shape on the stern. So maybe it's just possible, I suppose, that that's the case. I can't explain why there aren't layers in the upper part of it. It's just one of these little
There's always
mysteries.
been suspicions that there were other models.
Yeah.
There's certain evidence, there's slight differences in measurements. And I think at some stage I looked into the matter that there might be 3 models or 3 different models.
Eddie has a copy which he gave me of the survey that was done on the ship. The ship was brought down from Newton-le-Willows. If you look at a map of the Mersey today, it's slowly like a trickle up around Newton-le-Willows. And you'd wonder how a ship the size of the Tayleur was brought down from Warrington. And because they had a job getting it down, they had to launch the ship and bring it down on the highest tide of the year. And you have to also take into account that the Mersey has the second highest rise and fall of tide in the British Isles next to Bristol. There's actually on the highest spring tides, there's a 30-foot rise and fall of tide. So that explains how if you look at the Mersey up and near Warrington and near Newton-le-Willows, it only looks like the Dodder. But on a great big tide, and they had all the channel marked out with buoys and a tug in attendance. Nevertheless, it did go aground with the nose, I think, at one stage, and a whole lot of the locals got out with poles and shoved it off, and they carried on their merry way. So that's just one of those anomalies that I just can't figure out. We probably never know. But there's no record of it actually. The only reference I ever came across to the fact that it was to have a steam engine was a statement by the mate, I think. It's mentioned in your book that he reckoned that the ship wouldn't answer because it needed the power of a steam engine pushing the ship along to make the vessel answer. But I don't think that's the case at all. I've compared the rudder and the lines of the vessel generally and the position of the masts to countless other sailing ships of the time, and they're almost identical. Ships of the same size.
I know I'm quoting second-hand repeated stuff, but in something that I read, it said that the rudder was designed for a fast ship, and that it really wasn't going to be able to manoeuvre in tight conditions.
Well, I don't think that's so, because look, if you look at, this was the era of the clipper ships. Now, that originated in America. There were wooden vessels, but they were about the same size as that, and they were designed to sail as fast as possible on the east coast of America, round Cape Horn and up to San Francisco. They subsequently sailed out to the Far East, places like that, and made they outpaced steamships even. And if you look at the lines of those and the shape of the rudder, absolutely identical to the rudder that's on that model over there. So I don't buy into the idea that there was anything wrong with the shape of the rudder or the hull, or that the masts were too far forward or too far back or anything else. Now, and as I said, I've looked at, in Basil Lubbock's book, for instance, his books, he wrote a whole lot of books about sailing ships with great big pull-out lines of sailing ships. And they're all practically identical. So, who knows?
Well, even the fact the steam engine in those days on a long journey to Australia, you probably couldn't carry enough fuel or anything for it, you know.
The steam engine was for manoeuvring in and out of harbour.
Yeah.
You could substitute that for a steam tug.
Yeah.
Like it was normal practice to pull a ship out of the harbour.
Yeah, they wouldn't, when it took to Australia, they wouldn't be using the steam engine.
No, it would hardly ever been used, in fact. Not right, Eddie.
Exactly.
It would hardly ever been used, except maybe if they were in the doldrums and they had to just get to a place where they thought there might be a bit of wind or something like that. But in the main, like, it was what it was. It was designed as a fast sailing ship. And I read that there's a very good book written about the Royal Charter, the one that got wrecked on Marlborough, or on the north coast of Wales. And it describes very, very in great detail in that the sailing that they did. They did wonderful sailing and only used the steam engine very rarely. Almost identical in size and shape and everything else.
That was the old version of a bow thruster, wasn't it?
Yes, perhaps, yeah. The name of that Bourke, the Golden Wreck, was it?
Yeah,
Yeah, Golden Wreck.
Yeah.
Alexander Key.
Yeah, Alexander McKay, the guy that found the Mary Rose.
Was she due to calling the Queenstown on the way? I was told that.
The Tayleur, I doubt it very much.
I know you're thinking it was Titanic.
I doubt it.
And the other thing I read that, was there a tugboat on the deck, a small steam tug?
There was a small river steamer.
Yeah, it's said to have just floated off now, it was found somewhere. Don't know how true that is. All of the ships I was on had magnetic compasses just to stand by it because they used the gyro compasses. Now, a gyro compass is a totally different thing. It's worked by centrifugal force, and the theory is it's pointing at the centre of the earth, and you can interpolate it interpolates itself from that to give you a true bearing, true north and south. It's markedly different from the bearing that you get on a magnetic compass because you have to take in variations and deviations as well on that. You know all about that.
Well, you see, what wouldn't have been understood back in 1854 was that there's a magnetic signature on a ship. Now, it's got to do with the way it's lying on the stocks. And the hammering of the metal and the assembly of the metal puts a particular signature on the hull. Now, in the Second World War, when magnetic mines started, there was a fierce problem with magnetic mines in 1940, and there was cruisers blown up in Glasgow and several ships blown up in the Channel and the Thames estuary. And they developed this procedure overnight of degaussing a ship. And the way this would be done would be that a generator would be set up on the shore and a heavy cable swept the length of the ship with an electric current in it. And that would wipe the magnetic signature, and therefore the ship was impervious to activating a magnetic mine. But that was temporary magnetism, and it would wear off after about 6 or 10 weeks, and the ship would have to be degaussed again. By contrast, the major warships put cables around the ship and ran the jenny on the deck of the ship and left it there permanently. But they could afford to do that for the battleships and the cruisers, but not for every merchant ship. And then the last measure was that they put a big hoop between the wings, the nose and the tail on a Wellington bomber and flew it over the sea at 50 feet, running a current to explode magnetic mines, pretending that there was a ship going across the top of the sea, and they could clear and sweep an estuary fairly fast using a plane. But the whole concept and business of magnetism was, some of that stuff was only developed 1940.
On practically all the, sorry Paddy, on all the modern ships that I was on, the degaussing gear can be seen in the tween decks usually. It's just a great big metal conduit with a whole lot of big cables about this size that run right around the whole ship. Sorry for interrupting you there,
I
Paddy.
was going to say that even if the ship was degaussed, the fact that it was a linear object would surely would have a field, not, you know, about the stern.
Apparently they could wipe the field,
I
such that it didn't set off a magnetic mine trigger.
Oh, wait.
If you look at a binnacle, a relatively modern binnacle, you'll see there's a great big iron sphere on either side of the compass. Binnacle is the housing in which the compass is kept, and there's a great big iron sphere, one painted green and the other painted red, and they're commonly known as Lord Kelvin's balls. Kelvin had a lot to do with the understanding of magnetism of ships.
There has to be a lot of oral history still massively around Portland and Russia and Rogerstown with regard, because it permeates all the older families in the area.
Yeah, which is mostly rot.
I was in a house in Rogerstown on Sundays, a 91-year-old man, the father of a guy I died with, and his great-grandfather was a farrier on Lambay under the name of Evers, and then they basically emigrated onto the mainland in Portrane and became Ivers, and the name is into various other things, but it's massive oral history there locally.
Yeah. It's an extremely well-known story in North County Dublin, because in actual fact a lot of the original divers who found the Tayleur were from that part of the country around from Laddie and Dockrell, yeah. And a lot of them are from Skerries and Rush and those kind of places like that. So thank you very much again for coming. Thank you.